The cup trembled in my hand before I understood why, and I was still trying to name the feeling when I heard a girl's name called across the courtyard like an insult thrown for sport. "Elspeth," a woman's voice rang out, pitched to carry to the elders on the stone steps, to every visiting lord I had brought with me to Varengard. "Come and stand before the Alpha King. Let him see what a wolfless woman looks like, since he has never had the misfortune." Laughter moved through the crowd the way wind moves through dry grass, quick and careless, and I felt my jaw tighten before I had even found the woman being spoken of. I had ridden into this hold 3 days earlier at the head of a small envoy from my own western holds, come to renew an old alliance and nothing more, and in 3 days I had learned the shape of Varengard's hospitality, its wine, its wary elders, its long tables. I had not yet learned this particular cruelty, and I did not like the taste of it. I found her by the way the crowd parted around her rather than toward her, a young woman rising slowly from where she had been scrubbing the feast tables, setting down her rag with a care that struck me at once as deliberate, the unhurried motion of someone who had long ago decided that hurrying only fed whatever hunted her. She was perhaps 26, plainly dressed, her dark hair coming loose from its binding, and she crossed the yard toward the high table with her chin held level and her eyes fixed on nothing but her own hands. I did not yet know her name meant anything to me. I only knew that something in my chest had gone taut the instant she began to move, as though a string long slack inside me had, without warning, found its far end and drawn tight. "Come, cousin," the woman who had called her said, delight sharpening every word. I placed her now, Usable, one of the pack's own blood, seated near enough the elders to matter. "Show the king your empty hands. Show him you have nothing beneath your skin." The woman called Elspeth stopped an arm's length from my table and looked at nothing but her own knuckles. I watched old Elder Wraith's mouth curl in anticipation, watched a second elder, Voss, lean to murmur behind his hand to a third, Gray, and watched all 3 of them wear the particular smile of men who believe themselves safely above whatever is about to happen to someone smaller than they are. I had seen that smile on 100 faces in 100 halls. I had never liked it, and I liked it less now, watching it aimed at a woman who had done nothing before me but set down a rag. "She has served in this hall 12 years, Usable went on, addressing me now as though presenting an exhibit prepared for my benefit, and never once has she worn her second skin. We used to test her every winter, hoping. It became a kind of sport." She laughed lightly, inviting the gathering to laugh with her, and too many did. I felt something rise in me that I did not have a name for yet, not the ordinary anger of a guest offended by his host's manners, but something older, something that had been waiting a long time for a reason to wake. My hand tightened around the stem of my cup without my willing it, hard enough that I heard the metal groan, and I made myself set it down before I broke it in front of the whole courtyard. And then she lifted her eyes. Not to Usable. Not to the elders who had waited years, by the sound of it, for exactly this moment. She lifted her eyes to me, as though something in her had known before she did that I was the one worth looking at, and the instant her gaze found mine, the taut string in my chest did not merely hum. It caught the way dry kindling catches from a single dropped coal, and I understood, with a certainty that arrived whole and required no persuading, that I was looking at a door I had spent my entire life searching for without knowing it was a door. I had led men for 15 years. I had shaken 1,000 hands in courtesy and felt nothing from any of them. I had sat through 12 years of envoys pressing daughters of every house upon me, hoping to bind their line to mine, and I had begun, quietly, to believe that the bond the old songs promised was exactly that, a song, kept alive because kings need something to hope for besides duty. I did not believe it any longer, not with this woman's eyes on mine and my own pulse suddenly keeping time with a second rhythm I had never carried before. "Enough," I said. "One word, But the courtyard did not merely quiet, it froze, the way frost takes a pond in a single held breath, every ripple caught mid-motion. Usable's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I only meant." "I know what you meant." I rose from my seat, and even that small motion made the nearest elders draw back half a step, though I had not raised my voice at all. I did not look at Usable again. I could not have if I had tried. My eyes had fixed on the woman before me and would not be moved. "What is your name?" I said to her, quietly now, as though the courtyard had emptied of everyone but the two of us. "Elspeth," she said. Her voice came out steadier than I think she felt. "Elspeth of the Hearthrow, your Grace, Usable's cousin." "Elspeth?" I said it the way a man tests the weight of a coin he suspects is worth far more than its size suggests. "You have never shifted." "No, your Grace." She did not look away, did not soften it. "Never." "That is not the same thing," I said, "as being unable." The courtyard stirred at that, uneasy, and Elder Wraith cleared his throat with the particular authority of a man who has spent 40 years being obeyed. "Your Grace, forgive me, but the girl has been tested a dozen times by our own healers. There is no wolf in her to wake. It is a sad thing, but it is a settled thing." "Nothing about her is settled," I said, and I heard my own certainty land in the yard like a stone dropped into still water. It was not arrogance. It was recognition, plain as a man naming his own reflection in a glass he had not expected to find. I came around the table, and the crowd gave way before me, the way water gives way before a prow, and I stopped in front of her close enough to see that her eyes, which had looked simply dark from a distance, held flecks of amber near the center, like a coin held up to firelight. "May I take your hand?" I asked her, not a command. I had given 1,000 commands in my life, and I knew the shape of them, and this was not that. I offered it the way a man offers something breakable, waiting to see whether she would let him hold it at all. She gave me her hand. The moment my fingers closed around hers, the taut string in my chest did not simply hum louder. It broke open, heat racing up through my own palm and wrist and throat, until it settled behind my ribs like a second heartbeat learning to keep time with my own. I heard my breath leave me, ragged, and I watched her gasp at the same instant, as though the same fire had lit in both of us from one spark passed hand to hand. "You feel that?" I said. It was not a question either. "I don't know what it is," she whispered. "It is the truth," I told her, arriving late to a door someone shut long before I ever came looking for it. Usable's laughter had died entirely behind me. The elders had gone the color of old parchment. And I stood holding the hand of a woman I had known for the length of a single sentence, feeling something in my own chest begin, gently and without cruelty, to knock. I did not understand the whole of it yet, would not understand the whole of it for weeks, until pieces of an old wrong were finally laid before me by people who had carried the truth far longer than I had carried my crown. But I will set it down here as I came to know it, because it matters more than anything I felt standing in that courtyard. Elspeth's mother had died when the girl was 4 years old, and Varengard had always called it fever, quick and merciless, the kind that swept border holds in hard winters. What no one had told her, what I would not learn myself until her aunt finally broke a 18-year silence, was that fever alone had not taken her mother. She had died shielding her daughter from men who had crossed the border hunting a bloodline the old prophecies named dangerous to them. A line said to produce, once in an age, a wolf of uncommon color and uncommon strength, bonded before birth to whichever king would one day prove fit to stand beside it. Elspeth's mother, dying, had no time left to explain and no strength left to fight further. She had only enough to bind the wolf inside her daughter into silence. Not broken, not absent, only sealed, the way a well is capped rather than filled in, so that no hunter testing a child would find a single thread worth pulling. She had trusted that the seal would hold until something true and strong enough came to break it honestly, rather than by force. 22 years this pack had called her empty because of a mother's last act of love. I did not know that yet, standing in the courtyard. I knew only that I was still holding her hand, and that Usable had found her voice again, thin and scornful even as it shook. "This is absurd," she said. "The king is a stranger to us. He cannot simply declare her worth different because he touched her hand. My lord, I beg you, do not let 3 days of hospitality make a fool of Varengard's throne." "I have led men for 15 years, I said, without heat, without raising my voice, and I saw that this landed harder on Usable than any shout would have. I have shaken 1,000 hands in courtesy and felt nothing from any of them. I did not come to this hall a fool, cousin, and I will not leave it having become one. What I feel is not courtesy." "Then let her prove it," Elder Wraith said, some of his old authority creeping back now that the shock of my rebuke had passed. "If there truly is a wolf sealed in her, your grace, let it show itself. We have mocked her for years for lacking what she claims through you to possess. Let the gathering see the truth plainly, one way or the other." I understood the trap even as he laid it. A way to force a public failure that would silence my claim before it could take root, dressed up as fairness so that no one could later call it cruelty. My hand tightened slightly around hers, a silent question I hoped she would understand. "Shall I refuse this for you?" I would have. I would have turned every elder in that yard out into the cold before I let them use her again for sport. But she lifted her chin, and I saw something move behind her eyes that was not fear. "Let them look," she said. I studied her face a moment longer, searching for any sign that she spoke only from pride and not from true willingness, and found none. I nodded once, and did not let go of her hand as we turned together to face the gathering. The whole courtyard had gathered by then, drawn by the news the way smoke draws a crowd to a fire, servants at the hall's edges, warriors down from the walls, children pulled half-dressed from their beds by mothers who did not want to miss it. Torches had been lit against the falling dusk, their light lying orange and restless across the stones. Usable stood near the elders with her arms folded, her face a careful mask over what I suspected, even then, was the beginning of fear. "Close your eyes if it helps," I told her quietly for her alone. "Whatever comes or does not come, I am not moving from this spot." She closed her eyes. For a long moment there was nothing, only the crowd's breathing, the torches snapping in the wind, and beneath my own ribs a hammering I could not still. I felt the whole weight of what I was asking of her, and I hated in that moment every winter this hold had tested her and found her wanting, every gathering she must have stood apart from while I was elsewhere, learning nothing of her, wasting years I now begrudged myself bitterly. I moved my thumb once softly across her knuckles, and I felt something in her answer it, not a shudder, not a flinch, but a turning, like a key finding the last notch of a lock it had waited a lifetime to fit. It broke. I felt it in her hand before I saw it anywhere else. A release, not a tearing, as though an old knot were unpicking itself thread by thread, and warmth poured through her fingers into mine like water finding a channel it had been dammed from for a quarter of a century. Her skin did not merely prickle beneath my hand. I felt it hum, felt the hair along her arm lift as though the air itself had turned to current, and I heard the crowd's breath catch as one before my own eyes could tell me why. Light came first, not fire, not moonlight, but something that seemed to rise from beneath her own skin, the way dawn rises from beneath a hill, pale silver shot through with threads of deep blue, like a night sky deciding to wear itself as fur. Her hand slipped from mine, not because I released her but because her hand was changing shape within my grip, and I said her name once, low and disbelieving, before the world seemed to tilt and reform itself around a shape I had never before seen wear a soul so plainly in its eyes. When she stood before me, no longer a woman but a wolf unlike any I had witnessed in 15 years of hunts and gatherings and courts. Her coat was the color of moonlight caught in deep water, silver over blue over a black so soft it looked as though dusk itself had been combed into fur, with a single thread of pale gold running down her brow like a mark placed there on purpose by something wiser than chance. She turned her head, and in her new eyes I saw the same startled wonder I felt rising in my own chest, the look of a creature discovering for the first time that the cage it had lived in its whole life had never truly had a lock at all. The courtyard did not laugh. The courtyard did not speak at all. Usable's arms had come uncrossed and hung loose at her sides, her face gone the white of unbleached wool. Elder Wraith had taken an unconscious step backward, his mouth open on words that did not come. Elder Voss had sunk, without seeming to notice he had done it, onto the low wall behind him. Elder Gray simply stared, his hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though checking that his heart still beat in a world that had just proven itself larger than he had believed it to be an hour before. And I went down on one knee in the torchlit dust, not as a king humbling himself for show, but because my legs would simply not hold the weight of what I was feeling standing up. I do not know how long I knelt there. I know only that when her wolf's eyes met mine, something unguarded moved across my own face that I had never once, in 15 years of rule, allowed a whole courtyard to witness. "There you are," I said softly, and it was not a king's proclamation. It was the voice of a man greeting someone he had waited his whole life to finally be introduced to. She shifted back slowly, the light folding itself down into her skin the way it had risen, until she stood on her own 2 feet again in the ordinary dusk, shaking, her plain servant's dress somehow whole and unmarked around her, as though the change had been as gentle with the cloth as it had been with her. I rose and set my own cloak over her shoulders before she could feel the cold, letting my hands linger only long enough to be certain the fabric would hold, then dropping away, leaving whatever came next entirely her choice to make. No one moved to laugh. No one moved to mock. The silence in the courtyard had the particular quality of a held breath that does not yet know whether it wants to become a cheer or a confession. It was Elder Gray, of all of them, who broke it first, and not the way I would have expected a moment before. He rose from the wall and crossed the courtyard to stand before Elspeth, and though I saw her brace for another cruelty dressed as concern, he only bowed his gray head, slow and unpracticed, a gesture I doubted that stiff old man had made to anyone in decades. "I called you broken once," he said, so quietly it was almost lost beneath the torch's crackle. "I was the first to say it when you were small, and every unkind word after mine borrowed its shape from something I built. I have no right to your forgiveness, child. I will not ask for it tonight. I only wanted you to hear it said, once, plainly, the way you were made to hear the other for 12 years. Usable said nothing at all. She only looked at Elspeth, not with the old contempt, not even with fresh hatred, but with the flat, stunned look of someone recalculating an entire life's arithmetic and finding the sum had been wrong from the very first sum she ever did. She turned and walked from the courtyard without another word, and neither Elspeth nor I called after her. Some reckonings, I have learned, must be walked alone before they mean anything spoken aloud. I did not need Usable's shame to know what I had witnessed. I had felt the truth of it the instant the seal broke in my own hand, and everything after was simply the world catching up to what I already knew. I stayed at Elspeth's side while the courtyard slowly found its ordinary noise again, quieter than before, gentler, as though everyone present had been handed a piece of knowledge too large to discuss loudly. I did not speak of claiming her before them, made no grand pronouncement binding her life to mine in front of witnesses who had, an hour before, been laughing at her expense. I only asked, low enough that it belonged to no one else, "Will you walk with me, away from all these eyes, so that I might tell you plainly who I think you are to me, not as a king declares a thing, but as a man asks a question he is afraid to have answered wrongly?" "Yes," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. We walked out past the last torches to where the Hold's old orchard began, gnarled trees planted before either of our grandparents' names had been given to them, and the night there was quiet in a way the courtyard never could be. I stopped beneath the nearest tree and turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight I let every careful distance a king keeps even among friends fall away. I have sat through 12 years of envoys and offers, I told her. Daughters of every house that hoped to bind their line to mine. I felt nothing for any of them beyond ordinary courtesy, and I began to believe the bond the old stories promised was exactly that, a story, kept alive, because kings need something to hope for besides duty. Then I rode into this hold 3 days ago and passed a servant reaching for the same jug I was reaching for, and something in me that I did not know was asleep opened its eyes for the first time in my life. I felt it too, she admitted. I thought it was only foolishness. A servant does not get to feel things about a king. A servant, I said, is not what you are, and I suspect never truly was, even before tonight. But hear me plainly, Elspeth, I am not asking you to become anything tonight. Not my Luna, not my queen, not even my intended, if those words frighten you after everything this pack has put you through. I am asking only whether you would let me stay near enough to learn you properly, at whatever pace lets you trust that I mean what I say, for as long as that takes. She was quiet a moment, and I watched her weigh 22 years of being decided about by other people against whatever she felt standing in that orchard with me. I would like that very much, she said at last. Slowly, if it please you. I have spent my whole life being decided about by other people. I find I would like to decide this myself, even if the answer is the same one my heart already reached in the courtyard. Something in my chest eased at that, the way a held breath finally lets go, and I reached out, not for her hand this time, but simply to brush one knuckle, light as a moth's landing, against the curve of her cheek. Then we will go slowly, I said, and arrive exactly where we were always going to arrive. Behind us, faint and far off, the last torches of the courtyard were being carried in for the night, and among the retreating shapes I saw Elder Gray pause at the hall door and look back toward the orchard before he, too, went in. Tomorrow there would be questions, old wards to understand, a mother's grave I already meant to see given the honor it was owed. Tomorrow there would be Usable to face again, and whatever shape her shame chose to take once she had walked her long walk home. Tonight there was only the orchard, and the quiet, and the strange, steady miracle of having finally found, at 8:20, the one thing 15 years of rule had never once given me a reason to expect. I did not sleep well that night either, though I said nothing of it to her. I lay awake in the chamber Varengard had given my envoy, replaying the moment her hand had changed shape inside mine, turning over what Elder Wraith had said about a settled, sad thing, and finding that the word settled had never in my life made me angrier applied to a living person. By morning I had resolved that whatever else came of my time in this hold, I would not leave it without seeing that word struck from every record it had ever touched. I sought her out early, before the kitchen women had finished their first rounds, and found her already awake at the small hearth above the kitchens, her hands wrapped around a cup she was not drinking from. She looked up when I entered, and I saw in her face the same disbelief I still carried myself, as though we were both waiting for someone to tell us the evening before had been a fever dream. I keep touching my own chest, she admitted, to be sure I did not imagine it. I have done the same, I told her, though I have less excuse. I am not the one who spent 26 years being told. There was nothing there to imagine. She smiled at that, small and unpracticed, as though smiling in my presence were a muscle she had not yet trusted enough to use freely, and something in me wanted, more than I had wanted anything in a long while, to see that smile grow easier with time. I asked whether she would take the morning to visit her mother's grave, and whether she would permit me to come. She studied me a moment, the way she had studied the courtyard the night before, weighing whether my asking was truly a question or merely a kindness dressed as one, and then she nodded. We found the small burial ground on the eastern slope where the hold laid its dead among the birches, and the plain stone that had marked her mother's grave since Elspeth was 4 years old. I did not announce myself as we approached. I simply felt, through whatever thread now ran between us, the moment she sensed me behind her before she heard my boots on the frost-hardened grass, and when she looked up I stood a respectful distance off, unsure whether grief wanted company or solitude. "You may stay," she said, "if you would like to hear what I am only now beginning to understand." I knelt beside her, not touching, simply present, and she told me what she had pieced together in her sleepless hours. That word had reached her mother's younger sister, a woman named Halwyn who kept a cottage 2 valleys east and had not set foot in Varengarde's hall in a decade for reasons no one had explained to her. A rider had gone at first light to fetch her, and she had come, white-haired and trembling, and told Elspeth the rest of it standing at this very grave, as though she had been waiting 22 years for someone finally strong enough to hear it without breaking. "Your mother did not die of fever alone," I said gently, testing whether she could bear to hear the whole of it in daylight, having only had fragments of it from her the night before. "She died shielding me," Elspeth said, and her voice held steadier than I expected. "Halwyn says men came across the border in the last hard winter of my infancy, hunting a bloodline the old prophecies named dangerous, a line said to produce, once in an age, a wolf of uncommon color bonded before birth to whichever king proved fit to stand beside it. My mother had no army, no walls high enough. She had only enough strength left, after driving the last of them off with fire and her own claws, to bind what slept in me into silence, so that no hunter testing a small girl would ever find anything worth killing her for." "A ward built from love," I said, "mistaken by everyone who saw only its outside for a wound. Halwyn says she chose the deepest kind of sealing, the kind that does not merely hide a thing but truly stills it, because a half-hidden ward can be sniffed out by those clever enough to look twice. She wanted no one, not even kindly meant healers, to find a single thread to pull. She trusted only that if something true and strong enough ever came looking honestly, rather than by force, the seal would know the difference and let go on its own." She touched the cold stone. "She gambled 22 years of my scorn against a single evening of recognition, and she was right too, though I did not understand that until last night." I was quiet a long moment, my eyes on the birches rather than on her, wanting to give her whatever privacy grief still needed even from someone as close to her, suddenly, as I felt myself to be. "I owe her a debt I can never repay," I said finally. "She kept safe the very thing I did not know I was searching for. I will see this grave given a stone worthy of what she did here, if you will permit it." "I would like that very much," she said, and I watched her cry at that grave not from grief alone but from something far more complicated and, I hoped, far more healing. We stayed until the frost began to soften under the climbing sun, and when we finally rose to walk back toward the hold, I did not offer my arm the way courtly men do in old songs. I only walked beside her, matching my stride to hers, close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed, far enough that the choice to close that last small distance remained entirely hers to make. I felt her close it herself before we had gone 100 steps, and I did not think I had ever felt anything so quietly, thoroughly earned. The days that followed were not the days of idle courtship, however much the shape of them might have looked that way from outside. I had a kingdom 2 hard days' ride to the west that needed its king, and envoys arrived within the week pressing me to return. But I did not leave before I had done 3 things, each of them small, each of them, I hoped, the true measure of the man I wanted her to know me as. I asked Elder Wraith, in front of the same council that had called her a settled, sad thing, to strike that judgment from Varengarde's record and enter in its place only the plain truth, that the pack's own healers had lacked the means to see past a ward stronger than their arts, and that no shame attached to Elspeth of the Hearthrow for a silence she had never chosen and could not have broken alone. I watched Wraith's face as the words were read back to him, and it was the face of a man swallowing something bitter, because he had finally understood it was owed. I asked the hold stewards to strike her name from the servant's roll and enter it instead among the hold's free women, with land enough near the birches to build a house of her own if she ever wished one. Not as payment for a bond I hoped she would one day accept, but as restitution for 12 years of labor given under a misunderstanding that was never hers to correct. And on the morning before my invoice finally forced my departure, I asked her to walk with me once more to the orchard, where I took nothing from her and offered everything instead. Not a crown, not yet, not a title she had not chosen the pace of, but a small mate-marked token I had cut myself from pale river stone over 2 sleepless nights, threaded on a plain cord, carved with a single running wolf in the moonlight silver. I told her matched exactly what I had watched rise from her skin. "I will not ask you to wear it as a claim," I said, pressing it into her palm rather than fastening it myself. "Wear it only if some morning you wake and find you want the world to know what you already know in private. I will be exactly as patient waiting for that morning as I was waiting 20 years to meet you at all." She wore it before I had ridden past the first bend in the road. I looked back once and saw the pale stone catch the light at her throat, and I carried that single image with me for the whole 2 days home. I was gone 6 weeks, and every one of them was longer than any campaign I had ever ridden. I threw myself into the ordinary business of my own hold, grain counts, border disputes, an envoy from the southern kingdoms who wished to speak of trade and found me, I am told, unusually short with him. But no duty fully occupied the part of my mind that remained fixed on a birch slope 2 days east, wondering whether the light I had seen rise from her skin would come again for her alone, without a bond freshly breaking to call it forth, or whether some part of her still doubted it was truly hers to command. I learned later that it did come again, twice in those 6 weeks, and that the second time she called it calmly, the way one asks a trusted friend for company, and it rose gently, the silver and deep blue coat settling over her like a garment finally returned to its rightful owner. I was not there to see it. I have regretted that small absence more than I have regretted almost anything else in my life, and I told her so the moment I learned of it, and she only laughed and said there would be a great many sunrises left for me to watch her wear it. Halwyn stayed on at Varangard rather than returning to her cottage 2 valleys east, and word reached me, through the letters Elspeth and I exchanged nearly every week of that separation, that the old woman had become the closest thing to a mother Elspeth had known since the age of 4. I read of evenings by a small hearth, of a sealed letter 18 years carried and finally opened, of a mother's plain accounting of a frightened, furious night, of a hope stated twice in the same careful script, that whatever man someday proved worthy of breaking the seal would also prove worthy of the daughter beneath it. I read that letter's contents in Elspeth's own hand, copied out for me across 2 pages, and I do not mind admitting that I sat with it a long while before I could trust my voice to answer her. I learned, too, from those same letters, what Halwyn said of the coloring Elspeth's wolf now wore, a thing none of Varangard's living elders had troubled to learn in a generation grown careless with age. Silver over deep blue, gold at the brow, not simply an uncommon color, Halwyn told her, but the coat the old songs called a dawn wolf, said to appear only once in many generations, and always, if the songs were honest, at the side of a king strong enough to be trusted with a house instead of a possession. I read that and thought of every year I had spent believing myself already sufficiently tested by rule alone, and understood I had a great deal further still to prove. I learned, too, of harder things achieved in my absence. That elder Voss had sought Elspeth out separately from Gray's public reckoning, choosing a quieter hour and a quieter corner of the hall to admit, stiffly, that he had mistaken silence for absence more than once in his long life, and meant to correct that habit before age caught him entirely. That visitors had begun arriving at Varangard's gate under thin pretexts, wanting only to see with their own eyes whether the tale of the wolfless girl and her dawn-colored wolf was truth or exaggerated gossip, and that she had greeted each of them with the same plain courtesy she had once given while scrubbing their tables, needing none of their good opinion to know her own worth. And I learned, hardest of all to picture from 2 days' distance, that Usable had come to her door on the 9th day after the courtyard, without escort, without an audience to soften what she meant to say, and had stood on the threshold twisting her own hands the way Elspeth had once twisted hers before her cousin's cruelty. "I have spent 9 days trying to compose something worthy of what I did to you for 12 years, Usable had said, by Elspeth's own account to me, and I find I cannot. Every version sounds like an excuse dressed as an apology, so I will only say the plain thing. I mocked you because your silence frightened me more than I ever let myself understand, because some old, unkind part of me believed that if the pack could see you cast down, it would never look twice at whatever I was hiding in myself. I do not ask you to forgive that. I only ask that you let me try, slowly, to become someone whose company you would choose rather than merely tolerate." Elspeth wrote to me that she had not forgiven her fully that day, and told her so plainly, because a lifetime of small cruelties does not dissolve in a single doorway conversation, however honestly meant. But she had let her in for tea, and they had sat in a silence that was, for the first time either of them could remember, not unkind. I thought, reading it, that this was its own kind of courage, rarer in its way than the courage it had taken to stand before the whole gathering and let them look. When I finally rode back into Varengaard in the 7th week, I did not come with an envoy or a proclamation. I came alone, on a tired horse at dusk, because I could not make myself wait one more day behind the excuse of formality, and I found her exactly where I had hoped to find her, at the birch slope, in her human skin, watching the light go copper over the western hills. I dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and crossed the grass toward her at a pace just short of running, and when I stopped before her, I felt every scrap of the composure that was supposed to make whole rooms fall still desert me completely. "I told myself I would wait for however long you needed," I said, and then I spent 7 weeks discovering that waiting does not mean the missing stops. "It did not stop on my side either," she admitted, and touched the pale stone token at her throat, the one she had worn every day since I pressed it into her hand. "I have had 6 weeks to decide whether the courtyard decided this for me, or whether I would have chosen you regardless of any bond, any ward, any prophecy older than either of our grandmothers." "And your answer?" "That I would have chosen you," she said, "even if I had never once grown a second skin. The wolf only confirmed what a woman who scrubbed your table and handed you a jug already suspected the very first evening you rode through our gate." I did not kneel this time, the way I had in the torchlit dust before the whole gathering. I simply took both her hands in both of mine, an ordinary gesture between two ordinary people, and rested my forehead lightly against hers, and we stood like that a long while as the copper light went to gray, and then to the first quiet stars, saying nothing further, because for once there was nothing further that needed saying aloud. Word reached me a season later that Elder Gray had taken it upon himself to teach the youngest pups of the hold a new lesson before their first moon hunt each winter, that a slow wolf, or a silent one, or one that has not yet found its shape, is not a broken one, only an unfinished sentence waiting for its true word. I was told he used Elspeth's name for it only once briefly, and then never again, because he said she deserved to be more to the children of Varengaard than a cautionary tale retold at their expense. I thought, hearing it, that the old man had done more with that single restraint than most apologies manage with 100 words. I did not return to Varengaard alone again after that. I asked her, before the season turned, whether she would consider seeing my own western holds for herself, not as a bride paraded before a foreign court, but simply as a woman curious what land had shaped the man she had chosen. She said she would like that very much, provided she could return to Varengaard whenever she wished, and I agreed so readily that I think she understood, even then, that I had never once imagined asking her to give up the birch slope, the small house, or the grave on the eastern rise in exchange for anything I could offer her. My own hold, when she finally saw it, was neither grander nor lovelier than Varingard, only different, taller mountains, colder rivers, a great hall where my own people watched her arrive with the same wary curiosity Varingard's pack had once turned on a girl who could not shift. But there was no mockery in it, only the ordinary caution any hold shows a stranger, and I watched her stand unbothered under that scrutiny, plain and unflinching, and thought that whatever this pack had failed to give her in 26 years, they had at least, without meaning to, taught her how to be looked at without breaking. She did not stay in the West permanently that season, nor the one after. We settled instead into something neither of us had words for at first, and only later learned to call simply ours. Half a year in my hold learning the shape of my duties, half a year at Varingard tending her mother's grave and watching Halwyn grow steadily less guarded, less braced for a grief that no longer needed guarding against. I never once suggested that her half belonged to me more than my half belonged to her, and I came, slowly, to understand that this evenness was itself a kind of vow, spoken in scheduling and small compromises rather than in any grand ceremony before witnesses. Usable's slow beginning became, in time, something sturdier, or so Elspeth told me, and I believed her, having watched the two of them at table together grow easier year by year. She did not become the sister Elspeth's solitary childhood had denied her, not exactly, but she became someone Elspeth trusted to tell her the truth even when the truth was unflattering to herself, and I watched that trust rebuild, visit by visit, tea by tea, until Usable married, 2 years on, a quiet trader from the River Holds, and asked Elspeth, of all people, to stand beside her at the small hearthrite that passed for a wedding among their kind. Elspeth did, and told me afterward that forgiveness was not a single door swung open once, but a path walked slowly until one day you found yourself simply on the other side of it without remembering the exact step that had carried you across. I have carried that thought with me since, in matters far beyond the two of them. As for myself, I kept no separate life apart from hers after that first year, though we kept, by her choice and mine, the small house near the birches where she no longer lives alone. Some mornings, when the mist sits low over the slope and the light comes up the color of the coat she now wears every few days simply because she has finally earned the right to enjoy it rather than fear it, I walk down from the hold and find her at her own gate, and I ask, as I have asked every such morning since, whether she will let a king who could have simply claimed her the night we met join her instead for the climb. She always says yes. I have never once needed to hear anything else.